Hi, class. We are about to embark on our last lecture for Church History 2. It has been a pleasure to work with everyone during this term. I hope you have found the information that we've studied, the time period that we've studied to be helpful and profitable for your own personal life, your own personal walk with the Lord, and then being able to take that into your own churches and share that with those that you come in contact with, and hopefully just be a more well informed and a well thinking Christian, a well thinking believer, um, so that we can defend the faith well in the midst of all the various challenges that we are facing. And so, a lot of those challenges that we are facing is due to the fall of Protestant hegemony. And so, if you recall from our last lecture, when you look at American Christianity in the 19th century, and really, at large, the 19th and 20th century, you're going to see that the main theme of church history during this time period, again in American Christianity, is the rise and fall of Protestant hegemony. And so the rise of how the Protestant tradition really took hold of American life, American culture, American government, all those things, and then its decline and its fall in the 19th and 20th century. So there is this decline of Protestant hegemony, and what you find uh, is that in some of the various subcultures within Protestant hegemony, so Protestant hegemony, just kind of the umbrella term for various Protestant traditions, is that during this decline of the Protestant hegemony, some accept this and love this and say that this is a good thing, and then others, some says, no, this is horrible, this is terrible. So the religious right at the end of the 20th century is the greatest example to try and reclaim that identity within American culture, American government. And that failed. That push, that effort, really failed because the Christian candidate will ultimately have to compromise on various issues. If you're going to be an effective politician in America, you are going to have to compromise on various issues. And so the country is so diverse, and the system just isn't set up the way in which politics is not going to be the way to restore Protestant hegemony. Politics just is not going to be the way to restore that Protestant hegemony. The country just is not set up in that way. And again, because we have to, uh, because legislators, do have to compromise on various issues to accomplish goals and accomplish tasks. Uh, Politics is just not the best way to try and reclaim that. You can't elect a person who holds to all Protestant moral principles because, as a politician, you're forced to compromise. You just are. It's the nature of that role in this kind of democracy. So now we are going to look at a snapshot of Christian developments in the 19th century. So, specifically, the revivalism, Protestant liberalism, and modernism. So, we're going to take a snapshot at some of those developments in the 19th century. And so, revivalism, what we see, is with the Second Great Awakening, that gained momentum around the turn of the century, around 1800. But we see that its effects last much longer. It does originate in the Northeast. We have Timothy Dwight, who was a grandson of Jonathan Edwards. He was president of Yale, and he was convicted of the infidelity on campus. And so he preached against unbelief in a chapel service, in chapel services. So eventually in 1797, a group of students began uh, praying for revival, and it came in 1802. So from Yale, it moved to Dartmouth and to Princeton. In Princeton, three-quarters of the student body was converted, and a quarter of those entered the ministry. And so that's some of the beginnings of the Second Great Awakening that we see taking place. Again, originating kind of in the Northeast, uh, you know, 1797, students start praying for revival. It comes in 1802. We see it spread to Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, massive salvation accounts at Princeton. And so um, concurrently, you have a movement, in Kentucky known as the Cane Ridge Camp Meetings. Those were in 1801. So the 1801 camp meeting was a significant moment because a lot of people began to copy and use that format, particularly Baptist and Methodist. So Cane Ridge became like the Christian Woodstock. And it's out of these meetings that revivals began to spread. So, just to give you some numbers here, 25,000 people came to the Cane Ridge meeting. Again, this is 1801. 25,000 people came to that camp meeting. The Cane Ridge meeting was put together by a Presbyterian preacher, but the Presbyterian denomination didn't like it because of all the emotionalism involved. So, what you see with that is that in the Southeast and going west, there was growth in emotionalism. And one of those reasons was because the preachers weren't necessarily equipped to deal with the emotionalism because Baptists and Methodists want to present the message as simply as possible. And they used preachers with little education to accomplish that. You just need to feel called to the ministry, and that was sufficient. So, with the Second Great Awakening, we see church membership increase and evangelism and conversions increase. So the revivalism is different. This Second Great Revival, or Great Awakening, excuse me, is different from the first because it's not Christians being awakened to the gospel. The second is where lost people are coming to Christ. So the first Great Awakening started in the church. The second Great Awakening started with people coming to Christ. So during this time of revivalism, you get people like Charles Finney, who did protracted meetings and anxious benches, which were forerunners to public invitations. You have D.L. Moody, you have Mordecai Ham, who eventually converted Billy Graham. So during this time, the Sunday school ministries begin. So 1824, you have the American Sunday School Union. 1816, the American Bible Society. 1825, the American Tract Society. So what you're seeing is that people are looking for neat and creative ways to communicate the gospel. That's what's going on. That's why all these organizations are forming. That's why these different ministries are taking place. People are looking for neat and creative ways to communicate the gospel in ways that can be understood, in ways that people can understand. So what happened was that the gospel is extended to those who are not a part of the church. So what happens with this, though, is that the gospel becomes lost in the church, and that the gospel only becomes for the unchurched. And I can speak to this, growing up, the gospel message was only for those who are lost. The gospel didn't speak to believers. The gospel is spoken to unbelievers. So, it wasn't ever said, but the implied kind of culture and mindset was that the gospel is for unbelievers, and that the gospel has nothing for you once you're converted. And so, again, that's what's happening, is that through this focus of gospel message only focused to those outside the church, you see that the gospel becomes only for the unchurched. So what happens with the Second Great Awakening is that morality becomes a much bigger part within the church. So the gospel then becomes focused on how to become a Christian. Again, gospel only for the lost, justification. So while Christian behavior is preached to Christians, so this becomes sanctification. So in regular preaching, you get preached morality, and this becomes sanctification. So, in other words, you already have Jesus, so stop sinning. So stop sinning and start living in this way. The gospel becomes only the means that get people from being lost to saved, and then anything beyond that is not gospel but living rightly. Gospel preaching is just simply getting saved. Again, that was kind of the mindset, and that was kind of the impact. I'm sure many of you can agree that you have experienced something like that, where the gospel is only to get people saved. It has nothing to say to those who are already believers. So for the Christian, it's lived this way. So if you're already saved, then just do. do this, live this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. For the unbeliever, for the unchurched, that was a message of good news and hope of salvation. So, in doing this, it splits justification and sanctification. Uh, and you really only see this, in one part of American Christianity. Um, so, it splits justification and sanctification, which really should never have happened. That's not really the case. Our justification fuels our sanctification. It's meditating on the fact that we've been justified and how that happened that fuels our right living. Again, you see that in all of Paul's letters, again, reiterated through the New Testament and the scriptures that because of what God has done, we then live this way. And so the justification should fuel our sanctification, not have them bifurcated, not have them separated, and having one relegated to this sphere and one relegated to another sphere. So what happened is you get several generations that don't really hear the gospel because they were saved when they were six, and you eventually get to what the gospel is today. So several generations, kids say 5, 6, 7. Well, as they grow up, the gospel has not become for them. It's nothing but right living, right living, right living. No focus on the gospel itself, and so you ultimately end up with the church where it is today, which is going back to what it was at the first Great Awakening in the 1720s. It is evangelism that is decisional. You need to make a decision to accept or reject. And so the idea, the notion of rededication came out of this where you didn't live like a Christian. So since I haven't been, then I'm going to start anew. So really, at the end of the day, if what you teach doesn't require Jesus to die and rise, then it's not preaching. It's not preaching. The focus of the Christian message is Jesus, all about Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and that message then fuels the way that we live. It's meditating, it's remembering, it's knowing those deep truths and spearhead the direction of our life. So if what you teach doesn't require Jesus to die and rise, it's not preaching. And if, again, what you preach doesn't require Jesus to rise and to die and then to rise, excuse me, then you're just continuing that notion of just preaching morality, 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 and not the gospel hope. So, in addition to revivalism, another part of the snapshot is Protestant liberalism. Again, this is a response to the decline of Protestant hegemony. It's a response to the decline of Protestant hegemony. So, liberalism claimed that the reason that Christianity or Protestant hegemony was declining in the culture is that it's an old-fashioned religion. It is superstitious. It's not acceptable to the modern world. And so it reinterprets Christianity so that it does become acceptable to the modern world. One question to ask then is, why is Christianity unacceptable? And we can see and look to the rise of science. So as science discovers new realities, Christianity seems to not fit with these new discoveries. So as science comes to question the Bible and the origins of the world, it is no longer compatible with Christianity. So then you need to find a way to make it fit. So, Darwin did not invent evolution. It had been building for years. But he painted the world, or he painted the picture that the world is the way it is so that we no longer need a creator. He is dealing with why the world is the way it is. And the way he answers that is that they need to survive. And what happens with Christians is that God is no longer a part of the world. So with Newtonian physics, you still need a God to get the world going. But with Darwin, you no longer need a God to get the ball going. It doesn't require God to get things going. As for Christians, how do you respond to that? You can't just say that there aren't different species. So, in the end, Christians need to give a different purpose other than the origins of the world. And liberals did that by moving Christianity to the religious world. So, when I say that, Christianity deals with spiritual matters, not about science and nature. So, for Protestant liberalism, Christianity is an ethic. It's just something that you should live by. So, and from this, you get liberation theology, the social gospel, etc. So, in the 19th century, you get pietism with a social ethic. So, people like Schleiermacher says that Christianity is about a feeling. You know it to be true because you feel it. So, the feeling wasn't a sentimental or a passing motion. Rather, it was an awareness of where there was a greater being out there in which existence depends. So pietism becomes Protestant liberalism in the American context. So that what falls off, is historic Christianity is the doctrine such as the Trinity. So Christianity becomes a social ethic to make the world better. Protestant liberalism says take the gospel out and replace it with a social ethic. Help the poor, the needy, the oppressed, etc. And so this is happening in the 19th century. Revivalism, very individual, Southeast focused. Protestant liberalism, more social, societal, Northeast focused. And what you see developing here is kind of a social gospel versus an individual gospel. So with this Protestant liberalism and revivalism, there is the last parts of rationalism that refuse to disappear, and that is modernism. So modernism is a naturalistic gospel. It is on the heels of deism. So if you remember, all these are efforts to revive Protestantism. So it makes Christianity naturalistic, and that the God of Christianity becomes nature. Excuse me. It is not naturalism where you worship trees, but that science is telling you the story of God's work. So Christianity in the Bible tells a story so different than science, so the Bible needs to be jettisoned. The Bible talks about demon possession. No modern thinker would ever think of that. So what they reinterpret that as the Bible is talking about a mental illness. So what you need to do is to get back to the kernel of the Bible. And so the Bible is the story of how the ancients understood God. It is a text of their own theology. So it doesn't mean that the Jews were right. Modernists say, we know that creation didn't happen like Genesis 1 says, but that it really happened through evolution. Modernism really didn't have a home area. It runs up and down the American landscape. It was kind of focused, primarily in educational institutions. So, those are three snapshots, again, that we see in the 19th and 20th century, all with the goal of trying to reclaim Protestant hegemony, of maintaining that Protestant hegemony. Different areas had different focuses, but revivalism, was probably the greatest thing that you and I interact with on a regular basis in our churches. I would say, wager to say, and those really just kind of overflow from that second, Great Awakening. And so, one last thing to talk about briefly is that in reaction to all modernism and Protestant liberalism was fundamentalism. So, this started at Princeton College as they were responding to, higher criticism, which is a study of being more critical of the scriptures. And so they establish, the fundamentals of the faith. The Bible is true and inerrant. Jesus was born of a virgin. He was fully God and fully man. Substitutionary atonement of Jesus. Jesus' bodily resurrection and return. The authenticity of miracles, those kinds of things. Again, these fundamentalists begin at Princeton College, again, just laying out the fundamentals, the basic things of the Christian faith that you have to affirm, to be Christian. And so, these fundamentals ultimately get mixed in with some of the revivalism taking place. Eventually we get what eventually becomes known as evangelicalism. That's kind of how we get to where we are today. Again, a lot of the church today highly impacted from the Second Great Awakening and some of those trends that developed there, and those different people and those ministries that were started there. Again, the church is still highly impacted by those things today. And so those movements and revivalism coupled together with what these fundamentalists at Princeton College proposed really got us to where conservative evangelicals are today. And so, again, that's kind of the snapshot of Christianity in America, in the 18th, 19th century, 20th century. And so, um, just want to kind of lead you and guide you, up to where we are today. So, um, next week you'll have your exam. Don't forget that it will be based on the readings and the lectures. So, make sure you keep up with your textbook reading. It will be open note and open book. So any chapters, covered in the reading, anything there, anything from the lectures, fair game from anything after our first exam. If you have any questions, please let me know. It's been a pleasure, and God bless.